Have you ever heard of the Bossnut? Hey everybody, I'm Mike Levy. We're here in Sedona, Arizona for our annual field trip where we pit a whole bunch of value bikes against each other. And this bike right here is Calibre's Bossnut. It's a 130 millimeter travel, 27.5 inch wheeled trail bike. If you had never heard of Calibre before, I had neither, but they're a direct to consumer British company that sells relatively inexpensive bikes that they say can still be ridden hard. Now, how inexpensive? The Bossnut goes for 1,100 British pounds, and that equals about 1,400 American dollars, depending on taxes and duties. Now, for some perspective, that's about $600 less than the last drivetrain I reviewed. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if a $1,400 bike had some pretty sketchy geometry, but that's actually not the case here. Calibre has done pretty well. So the reach is a fairly modest 460 millimeters for a large. Head angle, 66 degrees. It's right in there with other trail bikes. Seat angle, 74.5. Now that's not nearly as steep as some other things out there, but it's steeper than bikes were just a few years ago. Chainstay length, 436 millimeters across the board for all sizes. Now none of those numbers are crazy, but we also have to keep in mind that they're numbers that we'll see on much more expensive bikes. So $1,400, pretty decent geometry. All right, so what are you getting in the suspension department for $1,400? The rear end is a single pivot linkage activated design, and it's driving a RockShox Monarch R shock. There's no pedal assist switch. You don't really need one on this bike. We'll talk about that later, but it does have adjustable rebound. That's paired with a 130 millimeter travel RockShox Recon RL on the front. And just like you guessed from the RL, rebound and lockout adjustments. Now all that is hung off a relatively simple aluminum frame, but there are some interesting details to note, including a 12 millimeter through axle rear end that's not boost. You have both kinds of ISCG tabs around the bottom bracket shell, and while the bike doesn't come with a dropper post, it is ready to accept one. It does have the cable stops for that. So the Bossnut weighs in at 32.4 pounds, making it a bit lighter than some of the other bikes here that actually cost a lot more. Now, some of that weight savings, though, is definitely coming from the wheel size. This is 27.5. It's got fairly lightish tires on it. The other bikes are 29ers, so their wheel sets and tires are going to weigh more. And as we see on a lot of inexpensive value-priced bikes, there's a SRAM SX 12-speed drivetrain on here. Now that gives you a very wide range of gears, from a very hard one to a stump pulling gear with that 50-tooth cog on the back. No excuses for walking. Slowing you down is a set of 2-piston SRAM level T brakes. Okay, so that's enough details about the Bossnut. Let's take this thing out on the trails, find out how it works.
Setting this bike up was fairly straightforward. One thing to note is that it doesn't have tubeless tires. Going the old school route, so that means we ran a little bit higher pressure than usual, around 23 in the front, 25 in the rear, just hopefully avoid some flats. We didn't, but we tried. And then as far as suspension pressures go, we both ran around 25% sag. And then the fork, the Recon fork. We had this Recon fork on a number of bikes. You might hear us say similar things, but RockShox recommended air pressure for our weight is around 85 pounds. We ended up running around 115
to 120. So for us here, to make this fork rideable, it needs about 115 to 120 PSI. So definitely overpressurized, and a few clicks of low speed compression as well too.
Yep.
But the rear end, 25% sag, everything was normal there. Let's get to climbing.
The geometry on this bike, pretty upright position, pretty comfortable. It's got those little wheels, so if you're used to riding 29-inch wheels going to the 27.5, you do notice they don't roll over things quite as well, but it feels fast enough. It's not the lightest bike, but it also doesn't feel overly heavy or draggy. Those tires roll pretty quickly, so kind of just gets along with its job just fine.
The 27.5-inch wheels, obviously technical climbing, it does make that a little bit more difficult. There's no way around that, but for a lot of people that doesn't matter. And to be honest, I didn't dab any more on this bike than on a 29er. I didn't really find it that much more difficult, no. A couple things to note is the bike pedals pretty well. We ran 25% sag. I mean, all these bikes seem to pedal quite well.
Pretty good. I mean, it doesn't have the climb switch, the cheater switch as you like to call it, but
it is cheating.
Maybe we won't get into that. That's a different debate. But either way, you can, there's nothing to adjust there. So it's simply just don't have to think about it. Just ride up the hill. And it does its job.
Yeah. And then the last thing to note on the climbing as well too is that, again, with the tires, that rear tire, it's a fairly fast rolling rear tire, which is nice. The compound, it feels quite stiff, and we need to run a little bit higher air pressure than would be ideal because of the casing. And again, there's a tube in there, so traction sometimes wasn't ideal on that front.
Yeah, I guess another thing to note while I'm climbing, sometimes I get thirsty when I'm climbing. There's no room for water, a little bit, just only once in a while.
Yeah.
There's no room for a water bottle inside the frame. You can mount one on the down tube, but yeah, just another little design feature to keep
Better
in mind.
than nothing.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, the thing feels sturdy. It doesn't feel like it's gonna fall apart. On flowy trails, we were riding Pigtail here. It's a fairly flowy trail with some rough sections at the top. It was my third fastest bike.
You know, you want a bike that feels solid, and doesn't want to feel like it's flexing and twisting all over. And that bike just felt like it did what you wanted it to.
Yep. So in a lot of places, the Bossnut feels just as capable as bikes that cost twice as much as it. But that's not always the case. When the speed picks up and it gets rougher and faster, you can feel that the bike is shorter. You can feel that it has less refined travel, let's call it. And it's just a less planted feeling than something like the Common Cell, or even the Norco Hardtail that, I mean, both of those cost almost twice as much as this.
The rear shock, there's enough support there. You can plow through things. It takes the edge off the hits.
I was honestly surprised. Like, I never felt like I needed to put a volume reducing spacer in that thing. I'd never felt like I needed to run way less seg. We were running at 25%. 30 is probably a little bit much, but it just works.
So the time testing loop, it's about a 10 to 12 minute loop, depending on what bike we're on. Involved a little bit of technical uphill, kind of a traversy section with some rocks and some tricky parts there. And then a downhill that had a couple rough sections, but more flowy than super gnarly, and a few jumps to top things off. My times on the Calibre, I had my 5th fastest time overall. I actually ended up with my 2nd fastest climbing time. Must have been feeling extra sporty that day. And then my descending time was also the 5th fastest out of all the bikes we tested.
I had faster times than Calibre on this bike. I just want to reiterate that.
Maybe the little wheels are better suited to you.
Maybe I'm a 27.5 rider this whole time and I just never knew.
Yeah.
So my loop time, I was 5th out of 8 bikes. On the descent though, it was tied for 3rd with 2 other bikes that cost way more. The Common Cell and the Norco Hardtail. So there you go, half as much money, just as fast. Pretty impressive.
So over the 2 weeks of riding, we've had a lot of time to get used to this bike, kind of find the pros and cons of that component spec. Let's start with those tires. I mean, I think that was really the main drawback of this bike. You can't set them up tubeless. Believe me, who tried just to see if it was possible, but they're very inexpensive wire bead tire. So no matter how much sealant and tape and all that you put in there, it's just unlikely that you'll be able to set them up tubeless. So a place like this, full of sharp rocks, cactus, you want, I'd say, need tubeless tires. So if you're purchasing this bike, plan on budgeting some money for new tires right off the bat.
Yeah, you're gonna need, $100+ for that, but you're also gonna need to be thinking about a dropper seat post. This obviously doesn't have one. Now, I can't fault Calibre for not specing a dropper seat post on a $1,400 bike, but if you spend another $200 on, say, like a X-Fusion Manic or something like that, it really unlocks this bike potential and you're gonna have way more fun. Other thing, rear shock bolt kept coming loose 3 times, 4 times.
Yeah.
It needs some Loctite on there, but it's all steel hardware, kept coming loose. You'll definitely need to pay attention to that.
This bike has SRAM's Level T 2-piston brakes, pretty basic entry-level brakes, but they do work all right. Not a ton of initial bite, but there's enough power on hand for a bike like this, for general trail riding, I'd say.
Another thing to mention, the rear wheel came out of true after only a few rides. Again, it's not the end of the world. It just needs to be brought back after tension, straightened, and it'll be fine.
Well, that rear wheel doesn't have boost spacing. So again, if you're gonna upgrade in the future, boost spacing, which is 12 by 148 millimeter rear axle width, that's kind of become the new norm. This has 12 by 142 millimeter rear axle width. Just means there's not quite as many options out there if you decided to switch out the wheel set. But
Who remembers 12 by 142?
it wasn't that long ago, so there's enough options. But it's just something to keep note. Some of the things, it's kind of the previous standard is what this bike has, so something to keep in mind.
Okay, final verdict on the Bossnut. I have to say that I was surprised, and I think it comes down to the frame. You've got a great starting point there with pretty decent geometry. You have a through axle rear end. It's stiffer than some of these other bikes, even if it isn't 148 millimeter wide. And pretty decent rear suspension.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. You know, this bike, someone get into the sport, they can start with it, upgrade a few things, and just keep continuing on.
Yeah. So bottom line, if you're a new trail rider, you're not riding anything too gnarly, this is a bike that can grow with you as you progress. It has a great frame. It's actually worthy of putting even nicer parts on as you get better. Nothing wrong with the Bossnut, is there?
No, solid. Great place to start. But there you have it. That's the Calibre Bossnut in a nutshell. Stay tuned for more videos from our Value Bikes field trip, as well as a roundtable discussion where we discuss all the bikes we had on test. Boom.